Hello, my name is Dr. Ominde and we are going to discuss cranial nerves using the lecture series of Professor Gigby, as you can see. So it's going to be a long series but very informative, so you need to pay attention. So cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. So peripheral nervous system is actually divided into spinal nerves that exit the spinal cord and cranial nerves that are from the brain. Then you can also divide these peripheral nerves as afferent that carry sensory information, okay, from the body to the central nervous system, or efferent from the central nervous system carrying the information to muscles and glands through secretomotor fibers. So you need to understand what's the embryonic origin of sensory nerves, okay? So you have somatic, where structures are actually from specialized ectoderm, such as the retina and membranous labyrinth. Then we also have sensory nerves that are from visceral part, that's the epithelium of the tongue and taste buds. So that's endodermal. So the somatic are ectodermal and the visceral are endodermal. So the embryonic origin of skeletal muscle, you also need to understand that the skeletal muscles in the body come from three sources. You have the somites from the paraxial mesoderm, then there's also the somatopleuric mesoderm of the body wall, and the mesoderm of the brachial arches or the pharyngeal arches. So again, these skeletal, or rather the motor nerves, are divided into somatic and visceral. So somatic, this is the muscles of limbs and body wall. These are from that originate from the somites and the mesoderm of the body wall. Then we also have extraocular and tongue muscles, which come from somites. So eventually the nerves to the tongue muscles and extraocular muscles will be carrying somatic information. Then we also have motor nerves to some skeletal muscles, but will be of visceral component, and these are mainly muscles that are originating from the pharyngeal arches, the mesoderm from the brachial arches. So those will be visceral component. So you need to understand that from the motor aspect, the muscles of the body wall, the bones, the joints, the skeletal muscles, the tongue muscles, extraocular muscles, and the skin, those are somatic components. And the cardiac muscles, smooth muscles in the organs and blood vessels, skeletal muscles of pharyngeal arches, and the lining of hollow viscera, all those form the visceral portion of the motor aspect. So with that information, you need to know how to classify peripheral nerves. So you can classify as somatic efferent, visceral efferent, or somatic afferent, visceral afferent. So those are the four categories, and this can be divided into general and specific, except this somatic efferent. Okay, all will be divided into two. So you'll have general somatic efferent and specific special somatic efferent. General visceral efferent and special visceral efferent. Okay, so all of them except the first one. So general visceral efferent, special visceral efferent. General somatic afferent, special somatic afferent. Okay, except the first one. So a typical spinal nerve contains fibers of the four general categories. Okay, a typical spinal nerve will contain fibers of the four general categories, and the special categories are present only in the cranial nerves. Okay, so we start the classification. So we have somatic efferent fibers. So this will innervate skeletal muscles from the limbs and body wall and extrinsic muscles of the eyeball and the tongue. So those are somatic efferent. So then number two, remember this somatic efferent is not divided into general and special. So it remains as it is. Then general visceral efferent. They innervate smooth muscles and glands, which are secretomotor. Special visceral efferent. Innervate skeletal muscles from brachial arches. Remember, that's why they're special, from brachial arch mesoderm. So these include muscles of mastication, the face, the pharynx, and the larynx. So those, the nerves to these they carry special visceral efferent information. General somatic afferent. Afferent is sensory. So touch, pain, temperature from the skin, somatic. Proprioception from muscles and joints and tendons. Again, those are general somatic afferent. Okay. Then Special somatic afferent is sensation, then somatic and is special. So you have the special senses, vision, hearing, and equilibrium. Then we have general visceral afferent. This is pain from the viscera. Okay, general visceral afferent, sensory from the viscera, and it's general, so it's pain. So these are the cranial nerves. Number 1, the olfactory. Number 2, optic. Number 3, oculomotor. 4, trochlear. 5, trigeminal. 6, abducens. 7, facial. 8, vestibulocochlear. 9, glossopharyngeal. 10, vagus. 11, accessory. And 12, hypoglossal. So you need to know the 12 cranial nerves in order, and their nuclei and the position on the brainstem. So, for example, oculomotor, which is the third cranial nerve, has 2 nuclei, Edinger-Westphal and oculomotor. Then this is the nucleus of trochlear nerve. Trigeminal has 4 nuclei. There's a motor nucleus here, okay, and it has a spinal nucleus somewhere down here. Then, and so on and so forth. There's a chief nucleus here, or trigeminal, and a mesencephalic nucleus and a spinal nucleus. So it has 4. It has a motor nucleus, chief nuclei, mesencephalic nuclei, and a spinal nuclei. So as we discuss each cranial nerve, you'll get to understand the nuclei of origin from each and where they are located. So out of the 12 cranial nerves, which ones are carry only sensory information? Cranial nerve 1, 2, and 8. Which one carry only motor information? Cranial nerves 3, 4, 11, and 12. They're purely motor. But we have some nerves that are mixed sensory and motor. So that's like trigeminal, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. And we have some cranial nerves that carry parasympathetic information or control parasympathetic function. So we have cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10. Oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. So we start with the first cranial nerve. It's called the olfactory nerve, responsible for smell. So you have bipolar neuroepithelium at the roof of the nose. This neuroepithelium will form olfactory nerves. Olfactory nerves will leave the nose through the cribriform plate. This is the perforated part of ethmoid bone on the anterior cranial fossa. And above the cribriform plate, olfactory nerves will get to the olfactory bulb and synapse with the mitral and tuft cells at the glomeruli. Then from there, olfactory tracts will form, and after the tracts now separate into 2 olfactory stria, the lateral and medial. So this is the nasal cavity. You have the olfactory epithelium. Then you form olfactory nerve that pierces through the cribriform plate, okay? Then get to the bulb and synapse with tuft and mitral cells. Then you form your tract. Then the tract will divide into medial stria. But what really forms the olfactory epithelium? You have 3 major cells in the olfactory epithelium. You have the olfactory neurons. The cell, you can see, this is the receptor cell. This is the one carrying the smell sensation. But we also have the basal cells for regeneration, and we have these supporting cells. So those are the 3 cells in the olfactory epithelium: supporting cells, basal cells, and the receptor cell that carries the sensation. So from the neuroepithelium, you form the olfactory nerves. Axons will pierce. It has many axons, will pierce through the cribriform plate, get above, okay, into the anterior cranial fossa, where the bulb is, synapse with tufts and mitral cells, then form the tract. So that's what we're saying. They are bipolar neuroepithelium at the roof of the nose. You can see they are bipolar. From the cell body, you have this and this. So this extension senses the smell in the nose, then this one now transmits. So bipolar neuroepithelium at the roof of the nose, they form olfactory nerves, pierce cribriform plate, get to the olfactory bulb, synapse at the glomerula with the mitral and tuft cells, and from there you form olfactory tract that later separates or divides into 2 olfactory stria. So this is your bulb and this is your olfactory tract that will divide, okay? So again, your olfactory epithelium, these are your receptor cells, they form olfactory nerve, pierce the cribriform plate into the glomeruli, synapse with tuft and mitral cells. Then from there you form your olfactory tract. Then what happens to the tract? It's going to divide into lateral olfactory stria and medial olfactory stria. The medial stria here it will pass through the anterior perforated substance, okay, and opposite the anchors through the anterior commissure. It's passing through the anterior commissure, so it relays into the other side. So this medial stria carries information from the right to the left through the anterior commissure. Then what happens to the lateral olfactory stria? It usually projects into 4 places. It projects to the primary olfactory cortex here, which is called the piriform lobe. So it projects into the primary olfactory cortex. It also projects into the entorhinal cortex, which is the secondary olfactory cortex. The entorhinal cortex, secondary olfactory cortex. Where is it found? The anterior part of parahippocampus. Then the lateral stria also projects onto the amygdala and also the mediodorsal nucleus of the thalamus, okay, through the orbitofrontal cortex. So this is your bulb, the tract, the lateral stria, and the medial stria. You can see this is parahippocampus. This is your anterior perforated substance. So some will cross through anterior commissure from the middle stria to the olfactory of the other side. Again, this is your anterior perforated substance. This is your lateral stria, medial stria, and you can see an olfactory tubercle here. So it projects into the entorhinal cortex, the piriform lobe. You can see your parahippocampal gyra here. So the lateral olfactory stria projects into the piriform lobe, which is the primary olfactory cortex, then also into the entorhinal cortex, which is anterior part of parahippocampus, and that's referred to as the secondary olfactory cortex. It also projects into the amygdala and the mediodorsal nucleus of the thalamus. Okay. So from the bulb, you have your tract. Then tract can project into the primary olfactory cortex, which is the piriform cortex, into the entorhinal area, the septal area, the mediodorsal nucleus of thalamus. You can go to the orbitofrontal cortex, the amygdaloid complex. So the olfactory pathway projects into many parts of the cerebral cortex. Okay, and that's very important. So what's the clinical relevance? When you have base of skull fracture, where the nerves are piercing, you can leak CSF through the roof of the nose. That's called rhinorrhea. And this rhinorrhea may be associated with lack of smell, which is anosmia. Because remember, the cribriform plate, the olfactory nerves are passing through. So if you affect the nerves, you'll not be able to sense smell. That's what we call anosmia. Rhinorrhea is leakage of CSF through the nose in base of skull fracture affecting the cribriform plate. So we go to the second cranial nerve, which is the optic nerve. It's for vision. This nerve is an outgrowth of the diencephalon, and it originates from the ganglionic cells in the neuron, on the retina. So remember, we usually have photoreceptors for vision. These are usually bipolar, they link or synapse with bipolar neurons that synapse with ganglion cells, which form optic nerve. The optic nerve fibers will decussate at the chiasma, okay? So this is your retina. So you have your photoreceptors that will synapse with bipolar neurons. You can see they are bipolar. These synapse with ganglion cells, and these ganglion cells are what will form your optic nerve. So the optic nerve of the right and the left, they will synapse at the chiasma, and from the chiasma you get your optic tract. So from the optic tract, what happens? You project to 3 areas. You can project to lateral geniculate body in the thalamus, from lateral geniculate body through optic radiation. Then from there, the fibers will pass through the retrolentiform part of the internal capsule into the primary visual area, which is the striate cortex. From optic tract, you can also relay onto the pretectal nuclei that is responsible for accommodation and light reflex. Then from optic tract, you can also project to superior collicula that is responsible for reflexes to light. So this is what we're talking about from the optic nerve, decussation of the medial fibers at the chiasma, then optic tract relay onto the lateral geniculate body through retrolentiform part of internal capsule. You have your optic radiation into the striate cortex, or primary visual cortex. So the optic nerve has 4 parts: an intraocular within the orbit, within the globe, intraorbital, that's within the orbit but outside the eyeball, so intraocular, intraorbital. Then within the optic canal is the intracanalicular part, and inside there, before it forms the chiasma, that's the intracranial part. So those are the parts of optic nerve.